Sarah Martinez had always believed that evil existed only in movies and news reports from distant places. At 28, she worked as a social worker in downtown Phoenix, helping families navigate difficult times. Her small apartment on Maple Street was her sanctuary, filled with plants, books, and photographs from her travels. She had no idea that her ordinary Tuesday evening would become the night that redefined her understanding of human cruelty and her own strength. The trouble began 3 months earlier when Sarah started receiving anonymous letters. At first, they seemed like harmless pranks from neighborhood kids. The messages were crude, telling her to mind her own business and stay away from certain families in the community. Sarah worked with domestic violence cases, and she assumed someone was unhappy with her involvement in a particular situation. She filed a report with the local police, but without concrete evidence or specific threats, there was little they could do. Detective James Rodriguez took her case seriously, but the letters contained no fingerprints, no return addresses, and no clear connection to any of her current cases. He advised Sarah to be cautious and to contact him immediately if the situation escalated. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she refused to let fear control her life. She had worked too hard to build her career and help vulnerable families to be intimidated by anonymous cowards. The letters continued arriving every few days, becoming progressively more aggressive in tone. They mentioned details about her daily routine that made her skin crawl. Someone had been watching her, noting when she left for work, where she bought groceries, and even what she wore on specific days. The realization that she was being stalked sent chills down her spine, but Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine while taking basic precautions. She installed new locks on her doors and windows, purchased a security camera for her front entrance, and started varying her routes to and from work. Her colleagues noticed her increased anxiety, and her supervisor offered to reassign some of her more challenging cases. Sarah declined, knowing that backing down would only encourage her tormentor. She had seen too many victims allow fear to control their lives, and she was determined not to become one herself. The breaking point came on a humid evening in late September. Sarah had just returned from a particularly difficult day at work, having helped a young mother escape an abusive relationship. As she parked her car in front of her apartment building, she noticed a strange smell in the air. It was chemical and harsh, unlike anything she had encountered before. She dismissed it as something from a nearby construction site and hurried inside. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, was watering her garden and called out a greeting. The elderly woman had lived in the building for over 30 years and knew everyone in the neighborhood. She mentioned seeing unfamiliar men near the building earlier that day, but Sarah assumed they were maintenance workers or delivery people. Looking back, she realized this was probably when her attackers were preparing their horrific plan. Inside her apartment, Sarah tried to shake off the uneasiness that had been building all day. She prepared a simple dinner, caught up on paperwork, and settled in to watch a documentary about wildlife conservation. The normalcy of the evening felt forced, as if she was trying too hard to convince herself that everything was fine. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in California, asking about her weekend plans. Sarah responded with forced cheerfulness, not wanting to worry her family about the threatening letters. Around 10:30, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. This was not unusual, as other tenants often came home late from work or evening activities. However, these footsteps seemed to pause directly outside her apartment for longer than normal. She muted the television and listened carefully, but heard nothing more. After a few minutes, she convinced herself that she was being paranoid and returned to her documentary. The attack began at 11:47. Sarah would remember this exact time because she had just checked her phone to see if she had missed any calls from work. The first sign of trouble was the smell of gasoline seeping under her front door. The chemical odor was so strong that it made her eyes water and her throat burn. She jumped up from the couch and rushed to the door, but before she could look through the peephole, she heard the sound of liquid being poured against the wood. Panic flooded her system as she realized what was happening. Someone was dousing her door and the hallway with an accelerant, preparing to set fire to the building. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but before she could speak to the dispatcher, she heard the whoosh of flames igniting outside her door. The heat was immediate and intense, and smoke began pouring into her apartment through the gap under the door. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by the gasoline that had been strategically placed throughout the hallway. Sarah could hear the crackling of flames and the sound of her neighbors shouting in panic from other apartments. The smoke was thick and black, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to see clearly. She grabbed a wet towel from her kitchen and held it over her nose and mouth, knowing that smoke inhalation could kill her before the flames ever reached her. Her apartment was on the second floor, making escape through the windows extremely dangerous. The fire escape was located near the front of the building, but reaching it would require her to go through the burning hallway. Sarah tried opening her door to assess the situation, but the metal handle was already too hot to touch with bare hands. The flames had turned the hallway into an inferno, blocking her primary escape route. The sound of sirens in the distance gave her a moment of hope, but Sarah knew that help might arrive too late. The fire was spreading rapidly, and her apartment was filling with deadly smoke. She had to make a choice between certain death from smoke inhalation and the slim chance of survival by attempting a desperate escape. Every second she hesitated brought her closer to unconsciousness from the toxic fumes. Sarah wrapped her hands in kitchen towels and forced open her front door. The blast of heat and flame that greeted her was like opening an oven. The hallway was completely engulfed, and she could see that the fire had spread to several other apartments. Her neighbors were screaming for help from their windows, but the main staircase was impassable. The people who had done this had effectively created a death trap, leaving innocent families with no way to escape. The realization that this was intentional murder, not just an attempt to scare her, filled Sarah with both terror and rage. Someone had planned this attack carefully, knowing that multiple families lived in the building. They were willing to kill innocent people, including children, to get to her. The cruelty of it was beyond her comprehension, but she knew that she could not let them succeed. If she was going to die, it would not be cowering in fear. The flames reached towards Sarah like hungry demons as she stood in her doorway, making a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel of fire, with temperatures that made breathing almost impossible. Her skin felt like it was being slowly cooked, even from several feet away from the main blaze. The toxic smoke burned her lungs with every breath, and she knew that she had perhaps minutes before losing consciousness. Sarah soaked her jacket and shirt with water from her kitchen sink, creating a makeshift barrier against the intense heat. She grabbed a flashlight, her phone, and her car keys, knowing these might be the only possessions she would ever own again. The wet fabric steamed against her body as she prepared to run through what looked like the gates of hell. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel in her throat, but her mind remained surprisingly clear and focused. The run through the burning hallway felt like it lasted forever, though it probably took less than 30 seconds. Sarah kept her head low and moved as quickly as possible, feeling the flames lick at her clothing and hair. The floor was hot enough to burn through the soles of her shoes, and she could smell her own hair singeing despite the wet towel she had wrapped around her head. The sound was deafening, the roar of the fire, the cracking of burning wood, and the distant screams of her neighbors trapped in their apartments. Halfway through the hallway, Sarah stumbled and nearly fell. The smoke was so thick that she could not see more than a few inches in front of her face, and she was navigating by feel and memory. Her lungs were screaming for clean air, and every instinct told her to stop and rest. But she knew that stopping meant death, so she forced herself to keep moving toward where she remembered the staircase should be. The staircase was partially collapsed, with burning debris blocking the upper portion. Sarah had to climb over smoldering pieces of ceiling and wall, burning her hands and legs in the process. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline kept her moving forward. She could hear the fire department sirens getting closer, but she also heard the ominous sound of the building's structure beginning to fail. Wooden beams were cracking under the intense heat, and she knew the entire building might collapse at any moment. When Sarah finally burst through the front entrance of the building, she was on fire. Her clothes, hair, and skin were burning, and she rolled on the ground frantically to extinguish the flames. The cool night air felt like a blessing after the inferno she had just escaped, but her relief was short-lived. The burns covering 30% of her body were already causing unbearable pain, and she could see that her hands and arms were severely damaged. Paramedics reached her within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as Sarah lay on the sidewalk, watching her home and everything she owned consumed by flames. The building was completely engulfed now, and firefighters were focusing on preventing the fire from spreading to nearby structures. Through her pain and shock, Sarah realized that several of her neighbors had not made it out. The screams from the upper floors had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Detective Rodriguez arrived at the scene just as Sarah was being loaded into an ambulance. Even through her pain medication, she was alert enough to see the grim expression on his face. He rode with her to the hospital, taking her statement while medical personnel worked to stabilize her condition. Sarah told him everything she could remember about the anonymous letters, the strange men her neighbor had seen, and the smell of gasoline that had preceded the fire. The emergency room at Phoenix General Hospital became Sarah's world for the next several hours. The medical team worked frantically to treat her burns and monitor her for signs of smoke inhalation damage. The burns on her hands and arms were third degree, requiring immediate surgery to prevent infection and preserve function. Her lungs had been damaged by the toxic smoke, and doctors warned that she might face long-term breathing problems. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the burn specialist who took over Sarah's care, was brutally honest about her prognosis. The road to recovery would be long and painful, requiring multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy. The burns on her hands were particularly concerning, as they might prevent her from returning to her work as a social worker. Sarah listened to the medical details with detached calm, still processing the fact that someone had tried to murder her in the most horrific way possible. The news media picked up the story quickly, reporting it as a suspected arson with multiple casualties. Sarah learned that 3 of her neighbors had died in the fire. Mrs. Chun, a young couple with a newborn baby, and an elderly man who used a wheelchair. The knowledge that innocent people had died because someone wanted to hurt her filled Sarah with a guilt that was almost as painful as her physical injuries. She had survived when others had not, and she struggled to understand why. Detective Rodriguez visited Sarah daily, updating her on the investigation and trying to piece together who might be responsible for the attack. The anonymous letters had provided few clues, and the perpetrators had been careful to avoid leaving evidence at the scene. However, surveillance cameras from nearby businesses had captured images of 2 men near the building on the day of the fire. The images were grainy and unclear, but they gave investigators their first real leads. Sarah's family arrived from California within 24 hours of the fire, bringing with them a mixture of relief that she was alive and horror at what had happened to her. Her sister Maria took leave from her job to stay in Phoenix and help with Sarah's recovery. Her parents, both retired teachers, struggled to understand how anyone could commit such a violent act against their daughter, who had dedicated her life to helping others. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse for Sarah. On one hand, the publicity put pressure on law enforcement to find the perpetrators and might encourage witnesses to come forward. On the other hand, it invaded her privacy during the most vulnerable time of her life and attracted attention from people with their own agendas. Sarah received hundreds of letters and messages, some offering support and others containing disturbing content that had to be screened by hospital security. Physical therapy began while Sarah was still hospitalized, focusing on maintaining mobility in her burned hands and preventing the formation of restrictive scar tissue. The pain during these sessions was indescribable, but Sarah forced herself to participate fully, knowing that her future independence depended on regaining function in her hands. The therapists were amazed by her determination and pain tolerance, but Sarah knew she had no choice but to push through the agony. Sleep became elusive for Sarah, not just because of physical pain, but because of vivid nightmares that replayed the fire in horrifying detail. She would wake up screaming, convinced she could smell smoke and feel flames on her skin. The hospital's psychiatric team provided counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder, but Sarah found it difficult to trust anyone new after what had happened to her. The knowledge that someone had studied her routine and planned her death made every stranger seem like a potential threat. 3 weeks after the fire, Detective Rodriguez brought Sarah news that changed everything. The investigation had identified one of the suspects from the surveillance footage. Marcus Webb, a 35-year-old man with a history of domestic violence, had been hired by someone to intimidate Sarah and stop her from interfering in family situations. However, the plan had escalated beyond intimidation to attempted murder when Webb's employer decided that Sarah posed too great a threat to their activities. The revelation that her attack was connected to her work with domestic violence cases both validated Sarah's instincts and deepened her resolve. She had been targeted not for personal reasons, but because she was effectively protecting vulnerable women and children from abusive men. The knowledge that her work had been making a real difference gave her strength during the darkest moments of her recovery. However, it also meant that the people responsible were still out there, potentially threatening other social workers and the families they served. Webb had been arrested, but he was refusing to identify the person who had hired him. Police believed he was afraid of retaliation against his own family if he cooperated with the investigation. This meant that the mastermind behind the attack remained free, possibly planning additional violence against social workers, judges, or others involved in domestic violence cases. Sarah knew that her survival was not just a personal victory. It was also a responsibility to help bring these dangerous people to justice. Detective Rodriguez spent countless hours poring over Sarah's case files, searching for connections that might lead them to the person who had hired Marcus Webb. Sarah worked with him from her hospital bed, going through dozens of domestic violence cases she had handled over the past 2 years. Each file represented a family in crisis, and many involved men who had threatened violence when their control was challenged. The process was emotionally exhausting for Sarah, as she relived traumatic situations while dealing with her own recovery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lisa Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite sharing the same last name, was a former client who had escaped an abusive marriage with Sarah's help 6 months earlier. Lisa's ex-husband, Richard Blackwood, was a wealthy contractor with connections throughout the construction industry and a history of using intimidation to solve his problems. When Lisa heard about the fire on the news, she immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez with information that changed the entire investigation. Richard Blackwood had not only threatened Lisa when she left him, but had also made specific threats against Sarah for helping with the divorce proceedings. He had told Lisa that social workers who interfered in family matters needed to learn their place, and that he knew people who could make problems disappear permanently. Lisa had been too frightened to report these threats earlier, but seeing Sarah's burns on television gave her the courage to come forward with the truth. The investigation into Blackwood revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that extended far beyond domestic violence. He ran a legitimate construction business that served as a front for various illegal activities, including intimidation, extortion, and assault. Blackwood had cultivated relationships with dangerous individuals like Marcus Webb, using them to threaten or attack people who challenged his authority or interfered with his interests. The fire at Sarah's apartment building was not his first attempt at murder, just the first one that had gained media attention. Sarah's recovery was complicated by the knowledge that Blackwood remained free while police gathered evidence for an arrest warrant. Her security was upgraded, with police protection both at the hospital and at the safe house where she would stay after discharge. The threat to her life had not ended with her survival of the fire, and Blackwood had proven that he was willing to kill innocent people to achieve his goals. Sarah struggled with the fear that her continued involvement in the case was putting others at risk. Physical therapy became more challenging as Sarah regained consciousness of the full extent of her injuries. The burns on her hands required skin graft from her thighs, creating additional wounds that needed to heal. The pain was constant and severe, requiring strong medications that made it difficult to think clearly. Sarah worried that the drugs were affecting her ability to help with the investigation, but Detective Rodriguez assured her that her statements were coherent and valuable to building their case. Dr. Thompson was cautiously optimistic about Sarah's physical recovery, but warned that the psychological trauma would require ongoing treatment. Sarah was experiencing classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and panic attacks triggered by smoke or the sound of fire sirens. The hospital psychiatric team worked with her daily, teaching coping strategies and helping her process the trauma in a healthy way. The media continued to follow Sarah's story, but the coverage began to shift from sympathy to admiration as details of her escape emerged. Reporters described her as a hero who had risked her life to expose a dangerous criminal network that was threatening domestic violence victims and the people who helped them. Sarah was uncomfortable with the heroic narrative, feeling that she had simply done what was necessary to survive and protect others from a similar fate. Marcus Webb's arrest led to additional discoveries that shocked even experienced investigators. Police found evidence in his apartment connecting him to at least 3 other attacks on social workers, judges, and domestic violence advocates over the past 5 years. These attacks have been disguised as random crimes or accidents, but the pattern became clear once investigators knew what to look for. Blackwood had been systematically targeting people who interfered with abusive men, creating a climate of fear designed to discourage intervention in domestic violence cases. The revelation that Sarah was part of a larger pattern of attacks provided some comfort, as it meant she had not been singled out for personal reasons. However, it also meant that Blackwood was far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. He had been operating a criminal enterprise designed to protect abusive men from legal consequences, using violence and intimidation to maintain a system that kept women and children trapped in dangerous situations. Sarah's colleagues at the Social Services Department were horrified to learn about the threats they all faced simply for doing their jobs. Many had received suspicious phone calls or noticed strangers watching their offices, but had dismissed these incidents as coincidental. The administration immediately implemented new security measures, including panic buttons, security escorts, and regular safety training. However, Sarah knew that these measures would be useless against someone as determined and well-connected as Blackwood. The prosecution team working on Blackwood's case visited Sarah regularly to prepare for the upcoming trial. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh explained that convicting Blackwood would require proving his connection to Marcus Webb and establishing his motive for targeting social workers. Sarah's testimony would be crucial, but Walsh warned that Blackwood's defense team would likely try to discredit her by suggesting that her injuries had affected her memory and perception of events. Sarah's family remained supportive throughout her recovery, but she could see the strain that the situation was placing on them. Her parents aged visibly during their weeks in Phoenix, and her sister Maria was losing weight from stress and lack of sleep. Sarah felt guilty for bringing danger into their lives and worried that Blackwood might target her family members if he felt cornered by the investigation. The knowledge that innocent people continued to be at risk because of her case was almost unbearable. Physical therapy sessions became a form of meditation for Sarah, allowing her to focus on concrete goals while processing the emotional trauma of her experience. Her hands were slowly regaining function, though she would never have full mobility in her fingers again. The physical limitations frustrated her, but she was grateful to be alive and determined to rebuild her life in whatever form was possible. Her therapists were amazed by her progress and attributed much of her success to her mental toughness and refusal to give up. The safe house where Sarah would complete her recovery was a modest apartment in a secure building across town from her destroyed home. The location was kept secret from everyone except essential personnel, and Sarah was required to follow strict security protocols whenever she left the building. The isolation was difficult, but it was necessary to protect her from retaliation while the case against Blackwood was being built. Detective Rodriguez became not just an investigator, but a friend during Sarah's recovery. He visited regularly to update her on the case and provide emotional support during her darkest moments. Rodriguez had worked domestic violence cases for over 15 years, but Sarah's attack had affected him deeply because it represented an escalation in the violence against the very people trying to protect vulnerable families. He was determined to see Blackwood brought to justice, both for Sarah's sake and for all the other victims who had suffered in silence. The arrest warrant for Richard Blackwood was issued on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 months after the fire. However, when police arrived at his home and business, they discovered that he had disappeared. His bank accounts had been emptied, his construction equipment had been sold, and his employees claimed to know nothing about his whereabouts. The realization that Blackwood had fled rather than face trial filled Sarah with a mixture of relief and frustration. She was safer with him gone, but justice had not been served for the people who had died in the fire. The manhunt for Blackwood became a multi-state operation as investigators traced his connections throughout the Southwest. He had resources and contacts that could help him disappear permanently, but he also had a pattern of violence that made it likely he would surface again somewhere else. Sarah knew that her testimony might never be needed in court, but she also knew that other women in other cities might face the same dangers she had survived. Her recovery was no longer just about healing her own wounds. It was about preparing to fight a battle that extended far beyond her personal experience. Sarah's discharge from the hospital came with mixed emotions. After 3 months of intensive medical care, she was physically ready to continue her recovery as an outpatient, but leaving the secure environment of the hospital felt terrifying. The safe house apartment felt strange and sterile compared to her destroyed home, filled with furniture that belonged to no one and windows that looked out onto an unfamiliar neighborhood. Every sound in the hallway made her jump, and she found herself constantly checking locks and escape routes. The FBI had joined the manhunt for Richard Blackwood when evidence emerged that he had crossed state lines and might be involved in similar criminal activities in other jurisdictions. Special Agent Maria Santos was assigned as Sarah's primary contact with the federal investigation, bringing resources and expertise that the local police department could not match. Agent Santos had worked organized crime cases for over a decade and recognized the sophisticated nature of Blackwood's operation. Sarah's physical therapy continued on an outpatient basis, but progress was slower now that she was dealing with the stress of living independently while under constant threat. Her hands were functional enough for basic daily activities, but she could no longer write for extended periods or perform the detailed paperwork that had been central to her career as a social worker. The reality that she might never return to her chosen profession was devastating, but Sarah tried to focus on the fact that she was alive when so many others had not been as fortunate. The trial of Marcus Webb proceeded without Blackwood, as prosecutors hoped that convicting the hired killer might provide additional evidence to use against his employer when he was eventually captured. Sarah testified via video link from a secure location, describing the threatening letters, the night of the fire, and her harrowing escape through the burning building. Webb's defense attorney tried to suggest that Sarah had been the target of random arson rather than a planned murder, but the evidence against his client was overwhelming. Webb was convicted on multiple charges including arson, murder, and conspiracy, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. However, he maintained his silence about Blackwood's involvement, apparently more afraid of his former employer than of spending the rest of his life in prison. The conviction provided some satisfaction to Sarah, but she knew that the person ultimately responsible for the attack remained free to hurt other people. The investigation revealed that Blackwood's criminal network extended into multiple states, with connections to other contractors, security companies, and even some law enforcement personnel. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than anyone had initially imagined, involving systematic intimidation of domestic violence advocates, judges, and social workers across the region. Sarah's case had exposed just one tentacle of an organization that had been operating successfully for years. Sarah's recovery was complicated by survivors' guilt that intensified as she learned more about the people who had died in the fire. Mrs. Chen had been a retired librarian who volunteered at local schools and helped immigrant families navigate city services. The young couple, David and Jennifer Kim, had just brought their first baby home from the hospital days before the fire. Robert Williams, the elderly man who used a wheelchair, was a veteran who had lost his legs in Vietnam and survived decades of challenges only to die because of Sarah's work. The families of the fire victims were supportive of Sarah rather than blaming her for their losses, recognizing that she was as much a victim as their loved ones. However, their forgiveness somehow made Sarah's guilt worse, as she struggled to understand why she had survived when others had not. Therapy helped her process these feelings, but the knowledge that innocent people had died because of her work would remain with her forever. 6 months after the fire, a tip from an informant led FBI agents to a construction site in New Mexico where Blackwood was reportedly working under an assumed name. However, by the time agents arrived at the location, he had vanished again, apparently warned by someone within his network that law enforcement was closing in. The near miss was frustrating for investigators and terrifying for Sarah, who realized that Blackwood was still actively evading capture rather than simply disappearing. Sarah began speaking publicly about domestic violence and the dangers faced by advocates and social workers who try to protect vulnerable families. Her appearances at conferences and training sessions were difficult because of her visible scars and ongoing trauma, but she felt compelled to warn others about the sophisticated threats they might face. Many social workers admitted that they had experienced unexplained incidents that made more sense in light of Sarah's story. The media attention surrounding Sarah's case led to policy changes in several states, with new protections for domestic violence advocates and increased funding for security measures at social service agencies. However, Sarah knew that bureaucratic changes would do little to stop determined criminals like Blackwood who operated outside the normal constraints of law and order. The real solution required catching and prosecuting the people who hire violence to solve their problems. Sarah's relationship with Detective Rodriguez evolved into a friendship built on their shared commitment to justice and their mutual understanding of the case's complexities. Rodriguez had become personally invested in finding Blackwood, working long hours and following leads that other investigators might have abandoned. Sarah worried that the detective was sacrificing his own health and family relationships in pursuit of her attacker, but she was grateful for his dedication. The safe house apartment never felt like home to Sarah, despite the months she had lived there. She was constantly aware of the security cameras, the reinforced doors, and the emergency protocols that govern her daily routine. Simple activities like grocery shopping or attending medical appointments required coordination with security personnel and careful planning to avoid establishing patterns that might be exploited by Blackwood or his associates. Sarah's family encouraged her to consider relocating permanently to California, where they could provide support and where Blackwood was less likely to find her. However, Sarah was reluctant to abandon Phoenix and the work she had started there. Moving felt like letting Blackwood win, allowing him to drive her away from the place where she had built her career and try to make a difference in people's lives. She also feared that relocating might simply put her family at risk instead of increasing her own safety. The anniversary of the fire was approaching, and Sarah dreaded the media attention that would inevitably accompany the milestone. Reporters had already begun contacting her representatives, requesting interviews about her recovery and the ongoing manhunt for Blackwood. Sarah understood that maintaining public awareness of the case might help in capturing Blackwood, but she was exhausted by the constant scrutiny and the pressure to be an inspiration for other survivors. Physical therapy had progressed to the point where Sarah could use her hands for most daily activities, though she still experienced pain and stiffness that reminded her daily of the attack. The scars on her arms and face were permanent reminders of what she had survived, but she had learned to see them as symbols of strength rather than shame. Children sometimes stared at her scars, but adults usually averted their eyes, uncertain how to react to visible evidence of trauma. Agent Santos provided regular updates on the federal investigation, but the leads were becoming less frequent and less reliable as time passed. Blackwood had clearly planned his disappearance carefully, possibly years in advance, and had resources that allowed him to stay hidden indefinitely. The FBI was coordinating with international law enforcement agencies, as there was evidence that Blackwood might have fled the country entirely. Sarah began to accept that she might never see Blackwood brought to trial, and that her healing would have to come from sources other than traditional justice. The work of rebuilding her life had become more important than the work of finding her attacker, though she remained committed to helping with the investigation in whatever way she could. Her survival had already served a purpose in exposing his criminal network, even if he remained personally beyond the reach of law enforcement. The question of whether to return to social work remained unresolved as Sarah struggled with both the physical limitations imposed by her injuries and the emotional trauma of knowing that helping vulnerable families had made her target. She had been offered positions with advocacy organizations and consulting opportunities that would allow her to continue fighting domestic violence from behind the scenes. However, the direct client contact that had made her work meaningful might be too dangerous to resume while Blackwood remained at large. 2 years after the fire, Sarah Martinez stood before a conference room filled with social workers, advocates, and law enforcement personnel from across the country. Her hands still bore visible scars from the burn she had suffered, and her voice occasionally caught when she described the most traumatic moments of her experience. However, the woman who addressed the audience was fundamentally different from the frightened victim who had barely escaped a burning building. She had become a powerful voice for reform and safety in the domestic violence prevention community. The conference was focused on protecting advocates from retaliation and violence, a topic that had gained national attention following Sarah's case and similar incidents in other states. Sarah's presentation covered not just her personal experience, but the broader pattern of intimidation and violence that Richard Blackwood's network had employed to protect abusive men from legal consequences. Her research had helped identify similar operations in 12 other states, leading to federal investigations that were slowly dismantling these criminal enterprises. Richard Blackwood remained at large, despite an international manhunt that had consumed millions of dollars and thousands of investigative hours. However, his network had been severely damaged by arrests and prosecutions that followed Sarah's case. 43 people had been charged in related cases, including corrupt law enforcement officers, private investigators who had stalked advocates, and contractors who had been used as fronts for money laundering operations. The convictions had disrupted Blackwood's ability to operate, even if they had not brought him to justice personally. Sarah had made the difficult decision to leave direct social work and focus on policy advocacy and training. Her injuries prevented her from handling the physical demands of crisis intervention, and the security concerns made it impossible to maintain the confidentiality that clients deserved. However, her new role allowed her to impact thousands of cases indirectly by improving safety protocols and training programs for advocates throughout the region. The transition had not been easy. Sarah missed the direct connection with families in crisis and the immediate satisfaction of helping someone escape a dangerous situation. Training other advocates felt important, but abstract compared to the hands-on work she had loved. However, she had come to understand that her survival and visibility gave her a unique platform to create systemic changes that would protect future advocates and the families they served. Dr. Thompson remained Sarah's primary physician, monitoring her recovery and adjusting treatments as needed. The burn scars would never completely fade, and Sarah would always have limited mobility in her hands. However, the doctor was amazed by Sarah's overall recovery and her ability to adapt to physical limitations while maintaining her commitment to helping others. The psychological trauma had been more challenging to treat than the physical injuries, but Sarah had made remarkable progress in managing her post-traumatic stress disorder. Detective Rodriguez had been promoted to lieutenant following his work on the Blackwood case, and he continued to coordinate with federal authorities on the ongoing manhunt. The case had become a personal mission for him, and he maintained regular contact with Sarah to provide updates on new developments. Rodriguez credited Sarah's courage with exposing a criminal network that had been operating for decades, protecting countless future victims from violence and intimidation. The anniversary of the fire had become an annual event for Sarah, not of mourning, but of remembrance and commitment. She visited the memorial garden that had been planted where her apartment building once stood, honoring the memory of Mrs. Chun, the Kim family, and Robert Williams. The city had dedicated the space to victims of domestic violence, creating a place where families could find peace and advocates could remember the cost of their work. Sarah's family relationships had strengthened through the ordeal, as her parents and sister had proven their unwavering support during her darkest moments. Her sister Maria had relocated to Phoenix permanently, starting a new career in victim advocacy that was directly inspired by Sarah's experience. The family had grown closer through shared trauma, developing bonds that might never have formed under normal circumstances. The safe house had been replaced by a modest apartment in a secure building, but Sarah still maintained extensive security precautions in her daily life. She varied her routes to work, avoided establishing predictable patterns, and remained in contact with law enforcement whenever she traveled. The hypervigilance that had developed after the attack would probably never completely fade, but Sarah had learned to manage it as a normal part of her new reality. Agent Santos had become both a professional contact and a personal friend, representing the federal commitment to finding Blackwood and dismantling similar criminal networks. The FBI had established a task force specifically focused on violence against domestic violence advocates, using Sarah's case as a model for identifying and prosecuting these crimes. Santos often consulted with Sarah on new cases, drawing on her unique perspective as both a victim and an expert in the field. The financial impact of the attack had been severe, as Sarah's insurance had not covered all of her medical expenses, and she had lost everything in the fire. However, donations from advocacy organizations, social workers, and private citizens had helped her rebuild her life and continue her work. A foundation had been established in her name to provide security assistance to advocates who face threats, funded by ongoing donations from people who were inspired by her story. Sarah's speaking engagements had evolved from simply telling her story to providing concrete training on threat assessment, security planning, and trauma recovery for advocates. Her presentations were in high demand because she combined personal experience with professional expertise, offering insights that purely academic experts could not provide. Each speaking engagement was emotionally challenging, but Sarah found purpose in knowing that her experience might prevent similar attacks on other advocates. The criminal justice system had failed to capture Blackwood, but it had succeeded in prosecuting many of his associates and disrupting his network. Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in these partial victories while accepting that perfect justice might never be achieved. The legal system was imperfect, but it was still capable of protecting vulnerable people when advocates like her were willing to take risks and speak out against violence. Sarah's dating life had been non-existent since the attack, as the combination of physical scars, emotional trauma, and ongoing security concerns made intimate relationships extremely complicated. She had focused entirely on recovery and advocacy work, finding fulfillment in professional achievements rather than personal relationships. However, she remained hopeful that someday she might find someone who could understand and accept the realities of her situation. The question of whether Blackwood would ever be captured remained unanswered, but Sarah had stopped allowing it to dominate her thoughts. She had survived his attempt to kill her, helped dismantle his criminal network, and built a new life focused on protecting others from similar violence. Whether or not he ever faced trial, she had already achieved a form of victory by refusing to be silenced or driven away from her commitment to justice. Physical therapy had evolved into a general fitness routine that helped Sarah manage stress and maintain her physical capabilities. Exercise had become a form of meditation that allowed her to process emotions and maintain the physical strength that symbolized her psychological resilience. Her body would never be the same as it was before the fire, but it was strong enough to carry her forward into whatever challenges lay ahead. The domestic violence prevention community had changed significantly in response to Sarah's case and similar incidents around the country. New safety protocols, training programs, and support systems had been implemented to protect advocates from retaliation. Federal funding had been allocated specifically for security measures at social service agencies, and law enforcement had developed specialized units to investigate threats against advocates. Sarah often reflected on the randomness of survival and the responsibility that came with being the one who lived when others died. She had not chosen to become a symbol or a spokesperson, but she had accepted the role because it gave meaning to her suffering and honored the memory of those who had not survived. Every life she helped save through her advocacy work was a victory over the forces that had tried to silence her. On quiet evenings in her apartment, Sarah sometimes allowed herself to imagine what her life might have been like if the fire had never happened. She might have continued her direct social work, perhaps starting a family of her own, living a normal life without constant security concerns or visible reminders of trauma. However, she had learned not to dwell on these alternate realities, focusing instead on the life she had built from the ashes of her former existence. The story that had begun with an attempt to incinerate her had transformed into something larger than one woman's survival. Sarah had become living proof that violence and intimidation could not silence those who were committed to protecting vulnerable people. Her emergence from the flames had inspired countless other advocates to continue their work despite the risks, creating a legacy that would outlast any individual case or criminal prosecution. She had not just survived the fire. She had used her survival to light the way for others who face similar dangers in their commitment to justice and human dignity.